The morning held the freshness of new beginnings as the Egyptians scurried about raising banners and preparing music for the great parade that was about to ensue. General Dak trotted up and down the market district, monitoring the pathway so that it remained quarantined and properly ordered for the arrival of Queen Ceria. There was a light scuffle taking place behind the rope in front of one of the shops, and General Dak paced over to the scene.
"What is the meaning of this?"
he demanded, with an angry frown. He towered over the peasants, and they were cast into his shadow. They looked up at the general, a sudden fear in their eyes.
Nothing, sire."
He tightened the reins on his horse and leaned in.
"Now hear this. Any act of unmannerly behavior in front of the Queen will be met with punishment within the Skywalk. You can count on that."
The men looked at each other and gulped.
"The Pharaoh does not wish to be made an embarrassment of,"
General Dak declared in a quick and firm voice. He straightened his posture.
"Especially when he entertains company."
The men nodded quickly enough to cause Dak to smile.
"Good. Now let's show the Queen how civilized the Egyptians can be."
The men scampered off, nearly tripping over each other. One picked up a broom resting against a wall while the other began asking coordinators for any way to help.
"Much better,"
the general said to himself with a plastered grin. The first notes from trumpets stationed through the city called out as General Dak turned his attention to the city gates, which slowly began to open. He reared his horse and darted quickly towards the gate, falling to a steady trot upon approach. As the gates widened, General Dak could see the rolling grassy fields within the transition district. He took a deep breath, captivated by its marvel, and noticed the convoy from Riven make their way into the city. A steady line of well-dressed catmen began to enter, holding high banners portraying their homeland. A dark purple with black etchings depicting a wooden home in a forest. Even though the material was made of darker colors, the banners seemed to shine as they entered. Others behind them were adorned with decorative war gear and elaborate spears and blades. All were decorated with fine jewels and gemstones that bore energies of power, courage, and intellect. Shortly after the entering of the second group, a crimson-red carriage emerged, floating like a boat on the sea as it entered the city, carried by 8 of the Riven. The red sheets fastened along the sides dropped, revealing the Queen, who looked around in splendor. As she drew nearer, General Dak called out with pride,
"My Queen, welcome to our great city of Ehyptia."
The Queen nodded and smiled at the general. The trumpets rang and the nation sang as the Queen was carried through the market district. As she passed through the market, she accepted offerings of the finest products from which the shop owners had to offer.
"Marvelous,"
she said, chewing on a tomato. She handed some of the food to a male cat that sat beside her, along with 2 others who looked about the city with awe. Eventually, they reached the end of the market district and stood before the towering image of the pharaoh's palace. A horizontal road bordered the front gates of the palace and intersected with the edge of the market district. The road, normally vacant as it acted as the border separating the royal district from the rest of the city, was crowded with the sorts of Egyptian people. General Dak jumped off his horse and walked to the Queen's carriage, taking the elegant hand of the Riven's noble leader. When she reached the ground, she exchanged smiles with the general. They examined the magnificent trees and pools of the outer royal district, and locked arms, beginning to walk through the park and towards the inner district. The 3 catmen that accompanied her in the carriage walked behind the Queen, while her other escorts remained at the gates.
"Your city is absolutely splendid, General. I am filled with reverence."
"Thank you, my Queen. Akhenaten has contributed much since he took the throne."
"I see. I visited Ehyptia for a short time long ago during the Dark Age."
"A brave voyage in such times of horror."
General Dak eyed her.
"We are stronger than we look, General,"
the Queen remarked playfully. She continued,
"I sought audience with Enoch in hopes that we could find a solution to those terrible times, but I found that I could not cooperate with his indecisiveness."
The general nodded.
"You know this. better than I.
Yes, noble queen.
The general looked forward.
Enoch was a drug addict, a reveler. I'd say the only act he contributed to Ehyptia was the erection of the belt at the Cosmo.
General Dak motioned to the northeast, and there stood a strip of 3 large golden pyramids.
But our pharaoh has outmaneuvered him already, building the rows of the hundreds you see behind him.
The queen nodded silently.
What do these pyramids represent?
I am sure you understand the divine representation in these pyramids, my queen. The sacred harmonics that such a structure creates is a profound mover of consciousness. These pyramids can also act as a power source, and can easily be converted for weaponization.
Really?
The queen's eyes widened.
Yes, my queen, but I fear I have said too much already.
Ceria laughed.
So I assume Akhenaten is far more competent than your pharaoh prior.
She purred. General Dak smiled. The sun reflected brightly from his shaved head and further radiated from the jewels that he wore on his crown piece.
Our pharaoh is far beyond anyone or anything that I have met. His mental clarity is like none other. His insight reflects his certainty.
General Dak looked at the queen.
Truly some of the necessary qualities for an effective leader. I look forward to working with him.
They reached the inner district, where a purple carpet bordered in gold was laid, leading up the stairs and into the throne room. They walked for the duration in silence, enjoying music played by the finest musicians from around the globe as they passed through the inner corridor. Members of the Royal Blackguard bowed as they passed, further increasing their sense of pride. They climbed the steps with ease until they entered the doorway to Akhenaten's throne room. More musicians played their instruments inside. The queen took her first glimpse at the pharaoh, who was smiling benevolently. She nodded, smiling back, and progressed closer towards him. As the duo reached the foot of the throne, several more notes rang out, and then silence. Akhenaten rose with open arms. "Welcome!" He started down the stairs. "Queen Ceria of the Noble Ribbon. I take great pleasure in your company," he said as he approached her. Ceria crossed and bent her legs, bowing in a formal feminine way. He arrived just a few feet in front of her. Akhenaten took her hand and kissed it. Ceria's tail perked up and the end curled at this gesture. "I trust your travels were free from trouble?"
Yes, there was little agitation on my journey.
"Splendid," he remarked. Akhenaten looked up at Jazz and motioned silently with his head. All made their way out of the room except for General Dak and Tenhut, who now made his way down the steps and towards Ceria. "This is my adjutant, Tenhut, commander of the Blackguard and executor of my will."
How do you do?
he said, taking the queen's hand with ease. A smile was hidden behind his mask.
It is a pleasure to meet you, Tenhut of the Blackguard.
All stood with pride and welcome as they exchanged formalities. "Now, if you will walk this way, my queen, we have a feast prepared in your honor," Akhenaten said, beckoning Ceria towards a hallway to the right of the throne. They moved to the corridor and entered into a hallway, passing several smaller hallways and rooms. General Dak, following from behind, turned down an intersecting hall to his right, leaving the royal entourage. From the ceilings to the walls and from the floors to the doors, everything was painted white. Ceria felt the darkness emanate from this color through her higher awareness. She sensed a dark power, as if the hallway painted white was actually an illusion, a mirage, concealing more sinister happenings within the palace chambers. Eventually, ridding herself of these notions and letting her confusion from her senses die out, they stopped in front of a door on the right. "This way, Your Highness." The pharaoh ushered Ceria through a door that led into a room much bigger than the queen imagined. The narrow corridor and its low ceiling deceived her as to the nature of the dining room, as its ceiling was at least 10 times as high. A large fireplace lined the far wall, a perfect distance from the banquet table. The room was decorated fabulously, made up of gold and silver and beige. The table itself was a marvel of its own, littered neatly with various foods and wines. They seated themselves at the table as several attendants saw to it that their cups were filled and their needs were met.
Remarkable. This place resembles nothing of the former when I sought Enoch. You have truly refined this great empire.
I have done what I can, making changes that I see are for the best, when and where I am able. After this meal, perhaps you would like to visit the Cosnode.
Delighted.
The Queen nodded. Her face glowed brightly with enthusiasm. I have brought in the finest foods from all corners of the world. Knock motioned to the items on the table. Even in Agria will you find no better. I assure you, he said, taking a bite from a tender slice of meat. The Queen looked at him, the fireplace beamed towards her, making her black fur and green eyes gloss and shine in the otherwise dimly lit dining hall.
So tell me, Great One, what are your plans regarding the restoration of Sanhel?
Noggin straightened himself, chewing his food while he looked at Ceria thoughtfully, before swallowing. It just so happens, Your Highness, that I have some of the finest maguses this world has to offer. At this current time, of course. He took a sip of his wine and sawed off another portion of meat. Sorcerers, seers, witches, and warlocks, they all have joined my ranks.
Your power and the force of magic must be otherworldly if cleansing Sanhel brings a returned state prior to the rising.
Indeed. You will find the Blackguard is quite limitless when uncovering masterpieces in their quest for knowledge. I trust you understand this, being one of the few nations still experimenting in the versatile range of perception. Ceria nodded.
Indeed. The Riven will always strive to understand the nature of the mind and the primal forces beyond it.
Noggin smiled. A true and worthy endeavor. Most of our world has ventured into this new age of materialism. With the rise of currency, it seems that a majority of our planet's more civilized inhabitants continue to strive towards never-ending trails of consumption. Noggin eyed Tenhut whilst breaking the stem from a bushel of grapes and placing it on his plate. Agria is at the helm of this movement. The Queen shuddered, and her brow furrowed in disapproval.
I find the nature of imperialism quite offensive.
The Emperor seems to believe otherwise. Noggin retained an exotic look in his eyes while he propelled a grape into his mouth. He crossed his leg and motioned for Isha, who stepped forwards to pour more wine.
A near-on, constant campaign to expand influence. I simply do not understand the inherent essence that makes up such ideals. Why must one feel the need to convince another of something, excluding the free laws that state to cause no harm or loss? It is in the nature of men to dominate and taint all they encounter,
Tenhad said, dismissively, with a wave of his hand. He forked some vegetables into his mouth and continued.
So uncivilized. Therefore, it is not just our responsibility, but it is our duty to secure the safety and stability of this planet. If we fail at this, it will be the Agrians who achieve the means to do so. You spoke of nature. Is it nature or indoctrination? Even though I find the workings to the north intolerable, was it not the Agrians who held back the terrors of the Dark Age? When propelled in such a situation as theirs, they had no other choice,
Tenhad remarked.
Rest assured,
The Commandant said, waving his finger about wildly.
that any they saved was simply a byproduct for their own interest. They were fighting for survival, as were we all.
Survival? Yes, the Pharaoh started. The entirety of this planet was jeopardized. However, you must understand that if it were not for such dark times, Agria could very well have spread its influence far beyond the north.
I see your point, Akhenaten. But should we rely on the notion of potential circumstance in spite of what has happened? Your Grace,
Tenhad began.
as I am sure you understand, expansion is the very nature of imperialism, either through diplomatic means or through military supremacy. You speak of indoctrination over nature, and indeed it is indoctrination that ensures the continuity of their very nature, a never-ending cycle of decadence procured by their own ignorance. It is the pseudo-art of diplomacy.
Tenhad finished slowly. The calm expression from his mask glowing from the fireplace reflected the warmth of the Egyptian people. Or perhaps it was the warmth of the dining hall. But nevertheless, Queen Ceria could not be sure.
Understandable,
She said.
Their sense of pride is a rendered fiction, a fairy tale. The nation must not be allowed to regain its former state of control,
Tenhad declared.
I know not of their proceedings.
The Queen started.
Does it appear to you, gentlemen, the gears of Agria are grinding towards conquest?
She asked. Tenhad looked towards Ceria.
If it were not for Senhel, Agria would be free from being on the defensive. While recovering, it would feed a vision of domination. You are privy to the nature, are you not? Once the gears begin to move, they will continue to conquer, always claiming land, always expanding,
He said, staring off into nothing. Tenhad looked up at the Queen.
This is why we must defeat them after the restoration of Senhel.
I fear in the future there will be only war. The question that remains is who will follow and who will be at its spear front, Akhenaten announced.
Ehyptia is now the strongest of all the nations and tribes. Surely efforts on your part would not require much.
Queen Ceria stated.
Unless, of course, the notion of us form with Agria.
Tenhad added. They looked at him.
Well, considering the current state of affairs, that is highly unlikely.
Tenhad chuckled and brought a spoonful of berries into his mouth.
You seem to be one of the few nations that went about untouched during the cold and dark ages.
Queen Ceria said.
We had our woes, great queen.
Tenhad motioned his fork in the air.
I understand the perceived threat of Agria, but what of Senhel and your campaign to restore it? How can this be done?
Akhenaten looked at each of them. There was a brief silence. He cleaned his mouth with a napkin and spoke.